Welcome to The Bone, the podcast that goes deeper. Here we cut through the noise and get straight to the core of the issues that matter. From real stories to raw truths, we dive deep into the conversations that shape our world and challenge our thinking. We're not afraid to dig in and get to the marrow of it all. Whether it's life, culture, or business in sports medicine, we're here to break it down raw and real. No filters, no fluff, just to the bone. With your host, Shelby Daly, we're getting to the bone. This is a clinically pressed, approved CEU podcast. Find the quiz to gain credit at clinicallypressed.org/courses. Clinically Pressed Company, making the complicated simple through results that give back. Find out more at clinicallypressed.org. Let's get started.
Well, welcome back to the Bone. Today we have Sway Medical on the podcast. We're going to talk about concussion evaluations and athletic training. Today we have Kim Wyand, physical therapist. She's an outpatient physical therapist that has specialized in concussion and vestibular therapy over the past 8 years. She joined Sway 2 years ago, and she is the director of the customer service experience team. And then Britt Gustafson, athletic trainer. She has 14 years experience at the collegiate and secondary school level. The last 7 years, she has served as the New England concussion coordinator for Select Medical and provided educational opportunities for all healthcare providers in concussion best practices. She joined Sway in the spring of 2024 as the customer success specialist. So welcome, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
So, since you guys are still somewhat new to Sway, but have great concussion experience, what are your favorite things about sports medicine outside of concussions?
Britt, you can go first.
Yeah, so I've always loved sports medicine. Just having that, if you look at it, the traditional role, like being out on the field, I loved being able to collaborate with so many great individuals, doctors, surgeons, fellow PTs like Kim. Our worlds collided earlier in our careers. So I think just being able to pull little pieces of everybody's, backgrounds has been really helpful molding me as a clinician.
Awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say, getting into PT, like when I first started, like in, undergrad, basically, I got into it because of sports. Like I was an athlete, hurt my knee in high school, was in outpatient PT, thought, oh, I could do this. This seems fun, like as a career. And truthfully got lucky going into PT school that I liked all the other aspects of physical therapy outside of sports, geriatrics, like there's so much to PT that's not just sports. Mm-hmm. And then, kind of circled back, ending up in sports because of concussion, because that ended up being my passion. It pushed me more into athletics and sports than, a good portion of my early outpatient, orthopedic, and I did a bunch of inpatient work as well. So concussion kind of brought me back to, where I ultimately wanted to be, however many years ago when I first thought of this idea.
Yeah. So, Kim, what was it about concussions that grabbed your attention?
Yeah, Britt kind of mentioned it. I really like the team aspect of it. And, both Britt and I came from Select Medical, different markets. I was in Philly, she was in Connecticut. We never really, met each other in person except for, some conferences that overlapped. But it was really connecting. And I'm married to an athletic trainer as well and went to Springfield College in Massachusetts. So there's a big AT-PT, kind of collaboration that I saw very early, in undergrad, just that collaboration. And I like that piece of concussion where you really have to have a strong concussion management program. You have to have a strong network of providers, not just ATs and PTs, but the physicians, the, neuro-ophthalmologists, like the pediatric concussion specialist. And, I know you're in the Philadelphia area and we were so spoiled, with CHOP and Dr. Master and just amazing concussion providers, in that area. So it was a really great place to, treat concussions and not knocking Connecticut or anywhere else out there, but we were having a great time in Philly.
Yeah. And Britt, what got you into concussions?
Similar to Kim, I would say. I was an athlete myself, growing up and into college. Unfortunately, I had concussions myself. Probably had a couple that didn't necessarily go diagnose. I'm not going to age myself, but there wasn't much of a rigid return to play back then. So, just experiencing that firsthand certainly made me want to help. But I also, on the other side of things, I love puzzles. And I feel like concussion is just this interweb of just problems to solve. And, again, just trying to be a resource for the athletes, the parents, especially in the secondary school setting, just so many questions come up because they just don't know. So being able to be a resource to even just listen, to what's going on, how they're feeling, can really help just guide that treatment. So,
yeah, definitely. So, I've been an athletic trainer for about 10 years now, and it seems like the evolution of concussion evaluations has boomed in that time. Sway, I think, is still kind of new to the market. Obviously, they've been around, but I wasn't really introduced till maybe 7 years ago-ish. Impact was kind of the main market for it. So how did we evolve from just SCAT5 to Impact, now Sway, and all these other applications with technology assistant and evaluation? Can you guys give us some backstory on that?
Yeah, I think it's just like you said, it's amazing to just see the boom of research. Like you look at the volume of articles with concussion as the key word, 15, 20 years ago to just a crazy spike. And obviously the media picks that up. So whenever there's something, I feel like, whether it's in the media or just gaining that traction, you're going to have the technology coming along with it. And certainly Impact being, the first and, when computers were really, again, that was kind of the uprise. Sway was really founded when mobile devices and the iPhone was really starting to boom. So Sway was founded in 2011. And that was, the few years before that even was when our founder, Chase Curtis, was, a grad assistant in a lab and, kind of thinking of all these ideas. And he down at Wichita State and, kind of developed the idea for it, realized the potential that a mobile device has. And that wasn't something, on the market then, and just all the power that could be in people's hands. So that was kind of the start of Sway there.
Yeah. Where do you see Sway going in the next few years with the increase in technology?
Oh, yeah. The opportunities are endless. That's a question we get often. And what I can really say, at least, is, if you've read the consensus statement, the Concussion in Sport Group, Amsterdam consensus statement, like Sway as a company, we are always trying to move with the evidence and move with the research. So if you've read that, you might have some ideas as to where we're looking and what we're trying to develop.
Yeah. So in a competitive market, since it's booming at this point, how do you guys differentiate yourself? How is it different?
Yeah, that's the big thing, is how can you differentiate? And I think the big thing is we're supporting the research that's out there. What we're trying to push and support other healthcare providers and using our system is to support their clinical decisions. And we have individuals like myself, Kim, and other healthcare providers on our team that have used the system, have used other systems, have been in the trenches, and can provide that feedback, that firsthand perspective, so that we're providing a product that's going to be helpful. It's got to be helpful. It's got to be easy to use. As an AT, we don't have a ton of time, right? So even going back to the SCAT 6 question, SCAT 5's question, those are very time consuming evaluations. They're great. They're comprehensive, but they're intensive on the provider's time. So being able to provide other resources that are going to ultimately provide the same information to make those decisions is really important.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I think that's something to, just highlight too. Britt and I both started as customers. I kind of have been at some point forced my way into a job and just said like, you keep folks from Sway kept asking for my opinion. And I said, well, here's my resume. And then, Britt was in a similar fashion of, we had a position open and, we obviously knew each other in the past and it was, hey, I got to take a leap of faith and go for this because we've used the product and stood behind everything it was. I loved it, as a clinician, and now being on the inside is just as fun.
Yeah. So the Sway app, is it all encompassing, or do you guys recommend that you utilize other evaluation tools along with it?
Yeah, great question. And if you think of concussion management, right, there's all the subgroups that you have to evaluate. So, Sway will definitely cover balance and cognition. That's like the primary, two measurements that we cover. We do have the VOMS. So if the, VOMS is part of your vestibular and ocular exam, like that can, easily be covered with Sway. But as most folks know, like when you are really doing a complete, formal concussion evaluation that involves aerobic exertion and maybe a cervical, like a more in-depth cervical spine assessment, all of those pieces come into it. And Britt, can certainly speak to the on-field portion. I would say what you see in the SCAT-6, the on-field portion and the off-field is really what you're going to see in Sway.
Okay. So yeah, Britt, you want to go into the on-field one or portion?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say like any big decision, right? You're dealing with the brain, kind of important. So I feel like just like if you're going to make a big purchase in your life, you're never just using one resource to make that decision. So very similarly, like you have to use all the tools in the toolbox. And Sway is going to help support those decisions. From a sideline perspective, there hasn't been necessarily that one tool that has really gained traction. I think SCAT-6 is really meant for the in-office side of things because of how long it takes. Whereas a sideline eval, we have to make decisions pretty quick. And, it's a go, no go decision. Is that athlete going back in or not? So being able to pair it with objective measurements and ideally comparing that individual to themselves with the baseline is so helpful. It's not the only thing. It's definitely not the only thing I use on the sideline, but it definitely helped, have that objective testing right there, being able to show it to the athletes, to the parents, to the coaches, just to support my decision. That's really what it is. We don't want to be by ourselves out there.
Definitely. So we do the evaluation. Is there any outlook of Sway helping with the return to play process? Like, I know that there's research out there of light activity after a concussion or, trying to think of some other, obviously neck manipulation sometimes help. I don't think you guys would be recommending that type of stuff. But are you guys giving cues on certain pathways to treat an athlete after an evaluation?
At this point, Sway is really an assessment tool to measure balance and cognitive function at different time points. So Britt and I certainly have worked with, at this point, probably hundreds of customers on talking through your school policy and return to play, the consensus statement, return to play protocol. When is the most appropriate time to do a Sway test? Is it at that 48-hour mark after relative rest? Is it before you get into stage 4 or, and some folks like to do it at every stage, and every setting is going to be different, your time, your resources, all of that. And Sway gives the flexibility for that. It's all on a mobile device. You don't have to like book a computer lab for baselining or, a lot of the testing can be just done, quick symptom check-ins, like on an athlete's phone. So it does make it pretty easy once you figure out what works best for your setting in terms of like a frequency.
Yeah, definitely. So I know I'm I've used Impact majority of my career, so sorry for using that as an example.
No, don't be.
But
They're the gold standard. They've been around, and there's so many studies that have compared at this point Sway to Impact and looking at that, and that's what we want to be compared to. That's what everyone knows, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, definitely. So I know when we used Impact at my previous job, we'd print out packets when we went to send the athlete to go get final clearance or for the initial evaluation. And I don't feel like the physicians really utilized those tests. Are athletic trainers supposed to be educating those physicians, or is it, obviously we're not sending them to a neurosurgeon or anything. Not everybody has access to that. So how do we better utilize these test results for the physician's evaluation and return to play?
Yeah, I think it takes a village, right, to educate. Sometimes those providers are so busy, pulled in so many different directions. So certainly we want, if our users feel confident in educating those providers, that means we've done a good job. They feel good in how they're utilizing that product. But we're also here to help. I've noticed, definitely, I've been with Sway only a short number of times, but I've used it for many years. And the involvement of whether it is the sportsman physician, the nursing staff at the schools, everybody is getting more involved with making those decisions, reviewing the results. What are we doing with those results? So getting everybody comfortable, getting their eyes on those results, super important. So, as much as we can involve those providers so that they can see the utility in it, it's huge.
Yeah. And we do have Sway University that has, self-guided videos that, we encourage our athletic trainers. Like if you have a team physician that you're adding to your system, add them to your system so they can get the notifications like when a post-injury test is done, or, they can, see the tests come in real time, whatever your, scenario is, but then they'll have access to Sway University. They can watch, results interpretation 101 and 102. And, for any customers that are listening, hi again, you've seen my face and heard my voice. Apologies. But yeah, it's, we're trying our best really to, reach as many, healthcare providers and make sure that folks feel empowered, with the data and understand it to make, to add to their clinical decision making.
Yeah. So as athletic trainers, obviously our demographic is more athletes. Have you guys looked at doing pre-participation exam for schools so that that's a resource for if a student gets a concussion? I know at Caltech we had the random students that their light hit them in the head, or they hit their head on the bunk bed or something. And it was like, well, luckily you're in athletics, but I'm not sure how the health center would necessarily deal with this. So are there places that are doing it for the student population also?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak, firsthand. I worked in the boarding school setting. I can tell you about 75% of those head injuries were not coming from the soccer field, right? So, those kids are constantly doing stuff, even when I tell them not to. So I baseline the entire school. Obviously, there is a cost to that, but luckily my school understood the platform. They felt like this is something we needed to support our decisions, and our health center was pretty involved with that. So I definitely was in a different setting than most ATs. But again, I think the head injuries is such it's a taboo topic. It's a buzzword. Like some people want their hands in it. Some people absolutely do not. So for the most part, if you have somebody that takes the reins and is like, hey, I need this is going to help me make those decisions, make those hard decisions, school's going to support that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And it's been really cool to see too, just the different types of groups that have joined Sway, certainly over the last 2 years, and even some folks that have been with us for a long time. We have a music drumline group, music corps group, a handful of police and fire departments across the country. As well as, different sports teams, and schools, that's the obvious setting, but, really cool and unique to see the different groups that are reaching out to us, and certainly a ton on the research side. military groups that are looking to do research with our platform, and even older adults. Like we have a group, a research group looking at patients with Parkinson's. We had at one point a group looking at domestic violence victims, and we're still related to head injuries, but certainly if you think of the platform of Sway as just objective balance and cognitive testing, like that can apply to so many realms. And that's what certainly drew me as a clinician, just thinking of like the endless possibilities that I ended up using Sway in the clinic for, not just for my concussion patients, but my older adults and the fall risk and the balance patients. It was really cool to be able to utilize that.
Yeah. So what is the youngest age that you can test somebody with Sway?
We have normative data down to age 9.
Okay.
But I'll be honest, I've tested 6-year-olds. It's like herding cats. And we certainly recommend the younger age groups that you do it in small, if you're baselining, you do it in smaller group settings. So I had a youth football group that I baselined when I was in Philly, and we took those like 6, 7, 8-year-olds and modified the test a little bit. We didn't put them through the entire battery of tests that the older kids did, but we did a balance test on them, and I think our reaction time. So just shorter, quicker, but still got some measurements on these kids because, yeah, they're running around and, bashing heads.
Yeah. So like longevity wise, can an athlete keep the same profile number and it follows them, or does every school have to start a new account for them?
No, profiles can certainly move. We do that all the time. And, if a kid is transferring or from high school to college, they can, we can transfer that profile. And for folks that have been with us for a while, they know that the profile sharing feature is definitely a hot topic where, it'll be more mobile and less of, needing Sway's, support help for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that profile can follow them, wherever, and you'll see that historical data, which is really the most important part, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Like you want to see that year over year change. And that's a question that gets brought up a lot too. Historically with Impact, it's every other year testing. But what we've really learned over the last couple of years analyzing our data is, especially in the middle school and high school age groups, we are seeing clinically and statistically significant changes in scores in those adolescent years. I mean, and you think about it, like a high school freshman to a sophomore, they can have a growth spurt of 3 inches, or there's so many changes, obviously from a balance, but also a neurocognitive standpoint. I do think it's really important to get those measurements year over year.
Definitely. So for on the legal side, how do new laws or legislation influence how you guys create your program?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a just from like a policy and protocol standpoint, you're not going to find on Sway like this is how you use Sway. You need to follow these steps and do it at this time within the recovery. It's just not feasible because of how broad the settings are and how broad the settings of our users are. So I think the way the platform's set up is to allow for any of our clinicians to customize how they feel they need to gain that information and use that information. So that would probably be what I would say is how it's not necessarily we follow the laws to create protocols, but we allow the system to be customized for you to follow along with those procedures and stay up with the best practices.
Yeah. Well, and truthfully, I feel like the laws and legislation always lags behind the research. So like we're staying up to date with the research, and, the laws and legislation will catch up to the research at some point.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of red tape to get through on those laws and stuff. So with pre-existing deficits, so eye coordinations, balance, vestibular problems, can the app differentiate those type of things with the baseline?
What do you mean by like pre-existing, like something like diagnosed or?
Yeah, so I'm sure that there's questions asking if you've already been diagnosed, but I know in the younger population, sometimes they may have eye coordination problems, which affects balance, or if they do have crystallization in their vestibular system, sometimes their balance is off. And since you guys are based on balance testing, I wasn't sure, is there ability to catch kind of those deficiencies, or how do you guys maneuver around those type of things and making sure it's not a false positive or they just are really bad at balancing?
Yeah,
there is that.
I mean, we ask in a baseline assessment when a profile gets created if you have a history of concussion or a history of ADHD. So, the athlete or the patient taking the test can select those. And obviously, if it's on the post-injury side, like, you'll have someone monitoring and making sure they're, selecting the appropriate things. And then on the front of, like when you're looking at the data, you'll get a score of, say, whatever their balance score is. And our balance is scored on a 0 to 100 scale. But then you'll see where their score falls on a percentile bar, basically like on a bell curve, like where it falls in relation to their sex and age-related peers. So, if you do know that they have a, pre-existing condition or whatever the situation is, you can see where they fall to their normative peers. And maybe you would expect them, okay, because they have X, Y, and Z, I anticipate them, I'm okay with them being in a lower percentile because I know they have this, this, and this.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think the baselining, right? Having that baseline and noting if they have those pre-existing conditions, that makes it even more of a point to have that baseline versus comparing them to their peers.
Yeah.
So I think that's important, and documenting those pre-existing conditions, so that if those results aren't necessarily lining up with what you would expect to see, you know why.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, that's the argument for baselines. I always feel as a clinician, like I want to compare you to you. And like, when you're especially working with like cheer or gymnastics, where like these athletes have, I would assume, a much higher level of balance than their normative peers. Like I want to be able to know like what their normal state of balance is, and know that on the post-injury side.
Yeah. Well, that was always my grief with the SCAT testing was my college didn't do a baseline test for some reason in the SCAT, but then we had to provide evaluation or even per diem work. I don't know who this kid is. I don't have any information on him, and you want me to do a SCAT 5? Like, how does that help me? Because I don't know what their normal is,
Yeah.
Right.
So that's great to hear that they have profiles that can follow them around. I don't know when they do club soccer or, different tournaments with travel sports, if they'll have it pulled up on their phone or something. But, that's always been the hardest part about trying to diagnose on the sideline for these per diem events is I usually just kind of go off symptoms and, the neurological testing most of the time. So that's great to know that there is an ability to follow. But yeah, that was the biggest thing was we didn't have accurate baselines, and I argued with my head athletic trainer up and down, and it was just like, this makes no sense. Like they might just really suck at balance, but that's up in the air,
Yeah, I think with our platform, it's going to be similar to a lot of those other platforms. Like your baseline is only as good as your baseline is. So you still have to make sure you're providing an environment that's going to be successful for those athletes or patients to be able to test well. So that's really, really important. But back to the SCAT 6, like trying to baseline a SCAT 6, really the only settings that have the ability to do that are, the collegiate or professional settings, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio with those clinicians and athletes versus, sway where you really are unlimited to how many people you can baseline at once. It's really based on space and internet connection. So,
and how well the athletes listen.
That too, yes.
So with the accuracy and limitations, do you guys see any limitations with the SWAY application and administering testing?
Again, I guess in terms of limitations in what per se?
I guess if a per diem athletic trainer was using it for some reason, they obviously have a lot of money to have that program on their phone to test. If somebody did a one and done after a suspected concussion, how well would it provide information, I guess, off that
Okay,
one
yeah.
off?
Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously per diem, that is a huge setting, kind of growing with the times and the way that sports are evolving. But we do have several large groups that use per diem ATs, and they just add them to the system. You kind of you can have unlimited users.
Mhm.
So even if you have individuals that are cycling through teams or leagues, or how you can add them to the system if you know ahead of time. Certainly we're not really seeing those ATs have their own sway system to test. That at this time we're not, but not to say that there is opportunity for that to support them as well.
Yeah. So if they were cycling through teams, obviously we're not using the sway by itself, but how would it help somebody in the initial evaluation post-concussion if they didn't have a baseline? Or would it not be appropriate to use it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so if you don't have a baseline, basically what you'd be looking at is their data compared to the norms,
Okay.
And that's when your clinical exam and your history, your subjective history, what you're gathering from the patient, the parent, of like what they're, are they an honors student in all AP classes? And you're kind of getting the gist that like they should be in the higher percentiles. And then obviously once you're really in sway and you've done, multiple post-injury tests, or you're progressing them through kind of that post-injury or that return to play, we have reliable change data to tell you if the change between, post-injury test 1 and post-injury test 2, is that change actually meaningful, or is it just, normal fluctuation, in your scores. So, but then you really just have to, keep pushing them and see where that plateau is. Like, okay, their symptoms are down, they've passed the Buffalo concussion treadmill test, all these other, boxes are getting checked off, and now they've plateaued, they've kind of hit this ceiling of where their sway scores are. And, with the sway data and all the other pieces of the puzzle, I can feel confident that, I'm returning them to play, and they're back to baseline, even though they didn't have a baseline.
Yeah. So with the boom in the technologies, and most schools and settings are utilizing these computerized platforms, do you feel like there is sort of a dependency on using this with their evaluations, or do you think clinicians can still survive on doing evaluations on their own without the technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think they can survive, right? The Scat 6, that's derived from the international conference, right? Like these are highly rated healthcare providers across the world making these decisions and making a free tool. So there's always that, including VOMS too. VOMS is gaining traction. It already had some traction on the post-injury recovery side, but now more acutely on the sideline. That's a free tool. So I do see that this will continue to grow on the tech side of things, from a documentation side, utility side. It is easier, but there's always going to be that, a place for those other tools that it's a little harder to use tech, or maybe costly for some settings.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And at this point, any technology, whether it's like neurocognitive or like any of there's so much technology in concussion, like ocular motor stuff, pupillometry, like all of these things, nothing at this point, and maybe might be a little out of the loop on some of like the super high tech stuff, but nothing is diagnostic. The only thing that is going to diagnose a concussion is your clinical exam and judgment. Obviously on the sidelines, it's like a higher, pressure environment where you have to make that decision, and you have the when in doubt, sit them out. Like, it's not, especially in pediatrics, it's not worth risking. You're pulling them out no matter what. But at the end of the day, it's still, a solid clinical exam that is your diagnosis like criteria. There's no, cheek swab or blood test or like anything like that. So any piece of technology right now at this point is just an assessment and aiding in your decision. It's nothing's making the decision for you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think if any AT, if they're listening out there, listen to this. This is like one of the best advice I've ever gotten from a provider. Like, especially as a young AT, I always thought I had to make the decision, had to make a diagnosis right then and there. But especially for a head injury, there's no reason why you have to make, if you have the ability to diagnose, sure, go ahead, but you don't need to make it that instance, right? Especially on the sideline. You don't want to miss anything. You certainly don't want to put somebody back into play that may have a head injury. So it's a matter of making that first decision. Is that athlete going back into play or not? So that's what Sway's helping. That's what these other tools are helping. Making that first decision, allowing for time, allowing for that injury to manifest however it will for, it's going to be different for that athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And then, taking all that information and making a decision when, either the law tells you have to, refer when you have to, those types of things. I think that's so important.
Yeah, no, that is. And I think we get caught up because most other injuries you can kind of, yes, no, but then with concussions, there's so much gray ground that it takes a while for symptoms to show up. So I'm not sure what they're going to be in 5 minutes.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So with the business model and ethics, I'm going back to Impact again. With their best practices, it seemed very expensive to carry out from what I remember from their credentialing system was you do baseline, you do the post-concussion, and then there's supposed to be check marks along the way as they return back to play. But with their model, it's you pay per test. How are you guys different in that aspect for financial reasons for an athletic trainer?
Yeah. So, from a Sway standpoint, you pay per profile. When we say profile, that means athlete or patient, like every person has a profile. And then you have unlimited testing, on that profile. In the sports setting, you have unlimited testing for the year. Clinics, it's a, slightly different model, but especially on the sideline and whatnot, we don't want, the financial part to limit your clinical decisions. So a lot of our schools and universities will baseline. They pay for that profile on the baseline. And then in the event of an injury, it's a sideline exam. It's symptom check-ins every day or however often you want. And like I said earlier, you can do your Sway post injuries at any different markers within the return to play protocol. And we don't give, a ton of guidance of like, it has to be this and this, because it's going to be based on, your time and resources, but we don't want the financial resources to be the limiting factor. It's, do you have the time and bandwidth, or are you one athletic trainer to 500 athletes? And, we'd rather that be the barrier than, the cost of a test.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always found it odd to pay for 300 baselines and then 10 post-injury tests. Like, I don't know. I don't know how many injuries I'm going to have. So I think that it was always a little weird of a model for me. So like being able to know that I have this profile, I have a test on everybody, and now I can test them whenever I want, just made me feel a little bit more supported, to make those decisions when I had to make them, not have to wait to test because of, I don't want a fee coming in because of it.
Yeah.
And it does allow for multiple baselines. So if you have a fall sport athlete that is also playing lacrosse in the spring, you can re-baseline them with their lacrosse team and have an even more updated measure. Because any baseline, doesn't matter who does it, it's still just a snapshot in time of their abilities. So certainly when you have multi-sport athletes, or especially kids that have a history of concussion, that was one of the takeaways from the consensus statement of potentially baselining them more often. And I would really just challenge that on like, it depends what their risk for injury is. If they're not doing anything in the spring season, why am I going to baseline them just to baseline them?
Yeah, I always thought it was interesting. Not that we were not testing people, but we always felt squeezed on the test portion and being strategic and how many tests we were doing and the baselines. And it never made sense to me to do baseline testing every other year, or they should technically do a new baseline at the end of the season if they did have a concussion. So it was so mind-boggling of, well, what are we trying to do with this technology ultimately with the cost association? I don't think it's the best care if we're thinking of the bottom line at the end of the day. So I'm glad that it's a profile setup that you guys have. So with multiple organizations buying into or I don't know if they're buying in, but gaining access to the athlete's profile, how does that kind of work out? Does it get included with their package and then they just put in the profile code, or how do you link that cost-wise?
Yeah, so we have a couple different models, but essentially they pay for a certain package or bundle of profiles. So for the most part, ATs have a good idea, or the ADs have a good idea of how many athletes will generally come out for that year or that season. And then, luckily the ATs don't have to go in ahead of time and add all those profiles in. As soon as they provide that code for a specific group, so let's say soccer, the first section the athletes go through is a demographic section. So that essentially creates their profile in the group and under that school organization.
Okay. Gotcha.
And maybe when you were saying, like, if multiple organizations, like, what happens when, like, say a kid gets tested at like high school A, but then mid-year transfers to high school B, high school A started with them. So technically they paid for that profile. But then that profile could be transferred to the other high school. And the following year, if they stay there, then that becomes their cost. And it all, especially when it's just, well, maybe with the transfer portal, things are different, but like the movement isn't crazy. And we have a lot of large health systems that use us that have a ton of schools underneath their umbrellas. So a lot of times, like, the bigger health system will purchase a big bucket of profiles, and all the schools just pull from there. And a lot of different folks have it, set up, and school districts will do that too. It might not be the health system. It could be a district that has however many high schools and middle schools, and they just, all the schools pull from the same bucket.
Okay. Yeah, since my background's in soccer, it was, kids that swung up to like the national teams or something, like, since they're both in the same season at the same time, how would that kind of work with sharing a profile? But that kind of makes sense on how you guys explained it.
Yeah.
So the future, what do you guys think you're going to implement in the next 5 to 10 years? What's the outlook of Sway?
Can't give you all the secrets.
I know. 5 to 10 years, there's so much. I mean, even just in the last 2, like, year over year, we've had such a, big influx of customers and new users joining us. I think we just crossed over 12,000 healthcare providers that, have logins in the system and are actively using the platform, which is amazing. And a whole mix. I mean, athletic trainers definitely, at the forefront, but physicians, school nurses, PTs, all over the place. And as I mentioned before, if you're keeping up with the research, then you're keeping up with Sway. I think that's all we're at liberty to say.
That totally makes sense. So what are you guys excited about in sports medicine right now? What type of trends are you guys excited about?
For me, certainly kind of being in the profession for a bit now, like, it's been really cool to see even just the word athletic trainer. Like, you would watch football games on NFL and everybody's a trainer, so even seeing like that progression from, and there's a lot of people that can be a trainer, but now there's using the actual term athletic trainers, and like just really involving them in as part of the team, members of the team, and you're just seeing that trickle down as well. That's really cool for me to see, and makes me proud to be an athletic trainer for sure.
That's what I should have went first, so we could have ended on that. That's the way to do it. That's a good one. No one ever wants to follow Britt. She's always got the best one-liners here. What gets me, or what am I most looking forward to in sports medicine? I think especially since transitioning out of the traditional setting, I'm not seeing patients every single day. I think the technology piece is awesome. And I think technology is always going to be connected to healthcare. It's going to be slower. And when healthcare gets involved, like clinicians need research and need the, data to back up these cool, flashy products and technology pieces. But like, I think that's a piece that I really enjoy kind of connecting, is like looking at the research and being able to make technology, consumable for, my peers and colleagues. Even though I'm not, treating patients every day, we still get to be a part of it, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, any last points you want to make about Sway that we didn't cover today?
No, I mean, you can certainly find Britt and myself on LinkedIn. If anyone has any questions about Sway itself, you can, email sales@Sway Medical, or just our first name last name @swaymedical.com. We're always around to answer questions, or, find us on the gram, on LinkedIn, and probably LinkedIn's the better place.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on, and we hope to have you back in the next year to talk about the next evolution of Sway.
There we
in the
go.
next 5 to 10 years. Yeah.
Love it.
Perfect. Well,
Awesome.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
That's it for today's episode of To The Bone. I hope we've sparked some new thoughts, challenged your perspectives, or simply reminded you to dig a little deeper. Remember, life isn't just about what's on the surface. Sometimes you've got to cut deeper and get to the bone of what really matters. To the Bone podcast is a product of Daily LLC. It's hosted and produced by Shelby Daly, ATC, and Randy Daly. No clinical decision-making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can be present. For more on the show, visit www.tothebonepodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Get involved in the conversation. You can find us at www.tothebonepodcast.com. Drop us topic suggestions or be a potential guest. We're all about connecting with you, our listeners. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep cutting deep.